No humans were harmed or even used in the creation of this program. We created it from a script written by the presenter using a generative artificial intelligence platform. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome to today's program, Hack My MBA for Lawyers Decision Analysis. My name is Zach McGee. I'm a Senior Vice President, Business Affairs for Sony Pictures Entertainment. Prior to joining Sony Pictures, I was an in-house lawyer at NBC Universal, and before that, I was a lawyer at Davis Polk. I've been writing and speaking on legal education topics for the past 20 years, including having taught a course on legal ethics at Pepperdine Law School. I also currently serve on the mediation panel for the United States District Court for the Central District of California. As you might expect, I am speaking today solely on behalf of myself, and my views do not reflect those of my current or any former employers or institutions with which I've been affiliated. This is the first program in our Hack My MBA for Lawyers series, so I'd like to say a few words about the genesis and purpose of this unique series of CLE programs. Over 10 years ago now, I was an in-house lawyer who sought to move from a legal to a business role, and as part of making that transition, I decided to get an MBA. My thinking at the time was that I wanted to learn some of the finance and management skills that my clients generally learned in business school or in their work lives that we lawyers didn't learn in law school. If you've ever seriously considered going to business school, you know that getting an MBA is a time-consuming and expensive proposition involving 2 years of your life and about $200,000 in tuition if you get your MBA in an executive MBA program like I did, so it's certainly not for everyone. I was fortunate enough to have my tuition paid by my employer at the time, which made the decision to take the plunge a significantly easier one. If you will be paying your own way, I think you need to think carefully before proceeding, because some MBA graduates don't end up seeing the higher salaries they are expecting to justify the cost of the program. As a lawyer in the MBA program, I realized pretty quickly that there are some elements of the MBA curriculum that are tremendously valuable for practicing lawyers, and we've done the work to call those elements out and present them in a series of programs intended for lawyers who want to learn these skills without spending 2 years and $200,000 to get an MBA. Another key benefit of these programs is that business folks in general, and MBAs in particular, have their own language, sometimes called MBA-speak last. That can be difficult for non-MBAs to understand. The concepts themselves aren't difficult. Indeed, I can assure you from personal experience that law school was conceptually much more difficult than business school, but you need some familiarity with them in order to understand fully what your business clients are saying, how they think about legal and business issues, and to some extent, to be able to speak their language in order to represent them well as their lawyers. Increasing your fluency with the tools that business people often employ in the language they speak is one of the main purposes and primary benefits of this first program and the other programs in the Hack My MBA for Lawyers series. This program, Hack My MBA for Lawyers Decision Analysis, focuses on teaching lawyers a framework for making decisions involving problems that include substantial uncertainty. With decision analysis, you can take a complex problem, break it down into simple pieces, and then recombine those pieces into a framework, often called a decision tree, that will allow you to solve the problem. As a lawyer, you likely already know something about advising clients when they are making decisions that involve substantial uncertainty. For litigators, whether to accept a proposal to settle a lawsuit or take your chances at trial, whether to hire an expert witness, or whether to file a motion for summary judgment are all questions that involve substantial uncertainty and that decision analysis can help you and your clients answer. For transactional lawyers, whether to close a deal for the sale of an asset or whether to pass on the terms being offered by the proposed buyer, whether to take a proposed tax deduction that might later be disallowed by the IRS, or whether to purchase land that could have environmental issues are all questions that decision analysis can help you and your clients answer. Before we get started, I wanted to give an overview of what I plan to cover today. The first thing we are going to discuss is what is decision analysis. In terms of explaining the concept and identifying some of the limitations of decision analysis as a tool, next, we'll move into how to do decision analysis, and we've broken that down into 5 simple steps. Once we've discussed how to do decision analysis, we'll walk through two hypotheticals where we apply the tool. The first hypothetical is a litigation example where we use decision analysis to help us decide whether to litigate or to settle the case. Our second hypothetical is a more challenging and detailed transactional example where we can explore some of the complexities that you can use decision analysis to help you manage, including conducting sensitivity analyses to test the assumptions that you're making as you are creating your decision tree. As I'll discuss in a moment, decision analysis is focused on finding an optimal solution where the criteria we are using to define optimal is the set of decisions that maximizing something called expected monetary value. Put another way, it helps us determine out of all your various alternatives, which of those alternatives maximizes your client's expected monetary value, which you also can understand to be maximizing your client's net gain or minimizing your client's net loss. It's important to recognize that maximizing expected monetary value is rarely the only consideration that clients take into account in making an important decision, nor should it be in most cases. Finally, we'll have a brief summary of what we've covered today. Turning to the first topic, what is decision analysis in the MBA program? All MBA students take a course, often called Data and Decisions or Statistics, where they learn a number of different concepts, including expected value, probability theory, regression analysis, etc. But in general, the course will also include a module on decision analysis, which is the subject of this program today. Certainly for most of you out there, statistics, probability theory, and regression analysis is not going to be particularly useful for you. So we're not going to cover those things, but decision analysis is very useful, and that's the reason we've chosen it as the subject of today's program. In a nutshell, decision analysis provides a framework that you can use to take a very complex decision and break it down into smaller steps. Once you have broken it down, you can recombine it into what's generally referred to as a decision tree. And by using a decision tree, you can arrive at what is the optimal course of action depending on the alternatives you have and the outcomes that result from each alternative. The other key thing to recognize is that decision analysis is useful when you have outcomes that involve substantial uncertainty. So one of the examples I mentioned is the litigation decision whether to settle or litigate a case. If you decide to litigate, then the uncertainty that you're going to face is whether you're going to prevail at trial or lose. Decision analysis can help you by mapping out the various alternatives, whether to litigate or whether to settle, whether to make a summary judgment motion or whether not to do that, and then what would be the possible outcomes based on these uncertain events, such as whether you're going to win your summary judgment motion or whether you're going to win at trial. Then, by working your way backward, you can determine which of your alternatives is optimal in terms of your expected monetary value, which I'll define in a moment. Decision analysis is also very useful for transactional lawyers. Some of the decisions that you can use decision analysis to help you make as a transactional lawyer would be a decision whether or not your client should buy a piece of real property. And if your client is deciding whether to buy the property, whether your client should do a phase 1 environmental analysis, that would involve some cost, but also some benefit in terms of potentially finding an environmental problem that might save you money later, or even might convince you not to buy the property. Another transactional example is whether to advise your client to take a tax deduction that may or may not be disallowed. If your client takes the deduction, there is some percentage chance that the IRS will not allow it, and then that will have some consequences, such as back taxes as well as potential penalties and interest. You can take all of these potential outcomes, put them into your decision tree, work your way back, and determine whether on balance, your client is going to maximize his or her outcomes in terms of expected monetary value by choosing to take the deduction or not. That's basically how decision analysis works, and that's the framework that we're going to walk through today. This leads to an interesting question that many people ask when you talk about decision analysis, which is decision analysis ethical? This is not a program on legal ethics, but I do think it's worth spending a minute or two on that particular question. In my view, decision analysis is a tool that you can use to take a complex problem, break it down into steps, apply probabilities and outcomes to those different steps, and then work your way backwards to find the course of action that maximizes your expected monetary value. Just like any tool, you can use that tool for good or for ill, but the tool itself isn't immoral or illegal or unethical. Let's say your client is intent on evading his or her income taxes. You certainly could use decision analysis as a tool to help your client maximize the chances of successfully evading his or her income taxes. That would be morally blameworthy and likely also illegal and unethical to assist your client in that endeavor, which is the crime of income tax evasion. But the tool of decision analysis itself is neither morally praiseworthy or blameworthy. It's really how the tool is used and how the client ultimately decides to proceed and what his or her intent is that makes something illegal or amoral, or in the case of you as a lawyer assisting in illegal conduct, potentially illegal and unethical. Another example that may come to mind when you think about using an analytical tool to help a company find a profit maximizing solution is the famous Ford Pinto case. In that case, Ford used something very similar to decision analysis to come to the conclusion that it was cheaper for Ford to defend and settle lawsuits arising from a vehicle Ford make called the Pinto, that because of the way they were designed, could catch fire and explode if hit from a certain angle. Ford knew that this risk could have been eliminated if it had chosen to recall all of the vehicles and replace the gas tanks, but that would have involved millions of cars and millions of dollars of expense. Ford made the conscious decision not to replace the gas tanks because, having run the numbers, it expected to pay out less money in lawsuits and settlements than it would have paid for the replacements. This decision endangered the lives of millions of its customers and led to at least 27 deaths. In that case, Ford was charged with criminally negligent homicide in one of those cases, but was acquitted after trial. The point is not what happened to Ford in the Pinto case, as much as simply to observe that maximizing expected monetary value in most cases should not be the only criteria a company or really anyone should use to make an important decision like whether to recall a potentially dangerous product. Decision analysis is an incredibly powerful and useful tool for clarifying complex problems, but it's just a tool that your clients will need to use in a responsible way as part of making important decisions in a legal and ethical way. Put another way, I think of decision analysis as something that can be used for good or for ill, but at the end of the day, it's very useful in clarifying the optimal solution to a complicated problem as to which you can then apply these second-order considerations, such as, is it morally right? Is it legal? Will my client suffer negative reputational consequences? If he or she takes this particular course of action, will the morale of the client's employees suffer? These are the considerations that your clients can and should examine after you have used decision analysis to identify what are the actual financial gains and losses associated with the potential courses of action from which you have to choose. Decision analysis doesn't make the decision for your clients. It simply helps to identify the course of action that maximizes the client's expected monetary value, which should be measured against the other considerations. So with that introduction, let's turn now to the process of performing decision analysis. As I noted at the beginning, decision analysis is a tool that can take a complex problem, break it down into simple steps, analyze each of those steps, and then recombine that into what's often referred to as a decision tree that will allow you to solve the problem by coming up with whatever is the optimal course of action that maximizes your client's expected monetary value. As part of this program, we'll make available to you an Excel model that we will use for our hypotheticals and that you can adapt and use when you're creating your own decision trees and performing your own analysis. I've used the word solve because that's what decision analysis does. It provides a solution to a complex problem that involves uncertainty. Each decision tree we will examine is going to have a solution. There's going to be a course of action that's better than all the alternatives, and it's going to be the one that maximizes the expected monetary value for your client. Now, there is a difference here in the sense that this isn't the same as an algebra problem. If you had an algebra problem, 15x equals 10x plus 25, there's a solution to that in that x equals 5, and there's no set of circumstances in which x does not equal 5. That's just math. It's a little bit different when you're solving a problem that involves future events and uncertainty about those events. That is because you may end up with an optimal solution that may not produce the best outcome. One reason that could be the case is because, for example, an event in the future that was deemed unlikely actually happens. To give a very simple example, let's say you're thinking about the decision whether to litigate or to settle, and you think you have a 95% chance of prevailing at trial, and you do your analysis based on that 95% chance of winning, and we'll show you in the first hypothetical how to put some numbers around that. Based on a 95% chance of prevailing, you advise your client to go to trial. Now, of course, it's possible that the unlikely 5% outcome that you lose at trial is actually the one that happens, and your client is required to pay a substantial judgment. Unlikely events, of course, do happen, not as often as likely events, but they do happen. And in that particular case, of course, your client would have been better off settling rather than going to trial, even though the optimal result of the decision analysis was to go to trial based on the 95% likelihood of prevailing and the payouts associated with settling versus paying a judgment. Decision analysis is different from algebra because hindsight, like straight math, is always 20/20, and you never know how the future is going to play out as even the most unlikely event can happen. The key thing is that decision analysis will, based on the facts and the probabilities that you estimate as best you can at the time you do the analysis, show you how to pick the course of action that's most likely to maximize the expected monetary value for your client. That's a very powerful thing, and the mere fact that you can't predict future events with perfect accuracy doesn't detract from its power. It's also worth noting that in my example, I mentioned a 95% chance of prevailing at trial. It's often going to be hard to give an estimate like that, and we'll talk shortly about how you as lawyers can get comfortable making estimates for your clients of prevailing a trial or winning a summary judgment motion. I recognize giving probabilities of prevailing in litigation outcomes to clients is a very uncomfortable position for lawyers to be in. You'd much rather say to a client, well, I'm very confident that we're going to prevail, or it's much more likely than not that we're going to prevail, or I feel good about our chances. Any of those things feels and sounds much more comfortable for lawyers because you're not putting a specific probability on an outcome. The problem is that your clients are going to have a very tough time and likely are going to be very frustrated with you, particularly if they are MBAs or finance types who are used to doing decision analysis if you don't provide them with probabilities they can put into their model. In addition to probabilities, you'll also need to assign specific amounts to outcomes. In my example, in the case that your client loses at trial, you'll also need to assign a dollar value to what that payment to the plaintiff would be in that case. Now, there are lots of ways you can break that down. You can assess a total dollar number as a fixed estimate, or you can say there's a high case, a medium case, and a low case, and put probabilities on each one, which is something we're going to show you how to do in the first hypothetical. But at the end of the day, you have to put some numbers, both probabilities and monetary gains or losses, against these potential outcomes in order to do decision analysis. I know that's uncomfortable for lawyers, but thankfully, decision analysis, when combined with something called sensitivity analysis, can help to mitigate those concerns. By doing sensitivity analysis, you can back out of the probabilities and amounts you assign to see exactly how much each of them matters in the overall recommendation to the client. Going back to the recommendation whether to litigate or to settle, if your expected value of litigating is that your client will lose $200 million, but if you can settle the case for only $25,000, that's a huge difference, and it likely would be a very easy decision to settle, even if you estimate your changes of prevailing at the 95% level. Depending on the numbers, you can go back to your original estimate of 95% probability and say, you know what? I feel very confident in that 95% estimate, but even if we are only 75% likely to prevail, it's still a no-brainer to settle given the numbers. That is how you can use decision analysis combined with sensitivity analysis to road test your estimates of probabilities and monetary gains and losses to arrive at assumptions and recommendations with which you are comfortable, despite feeling decidedly uncomfortable, as most lawyers do, with giving estimates that include specific numbers. Another thing to keep in mind with decision analysis is that because it's focused on monetary value and dollars lost or dollars gained, the analysis can only quantify things that can be reduced to money. For example, it doesn't include psychic costs, or any other non-monetary consequences such as damages to one's reputation, loss of employee morale, etc. Think about another very simple example in your personal life. Let's say that, unfortunately, you're getting divorced, and the question is whether you want to engage in a custody battle over your children. You could use decision analysis to map out the alternatives and what the cost would be of each. But the point is, of course, that decision analysis would not take into account the significant negative psychic and emotional consequences that you, your spouse, and your children would suffer as a result of going through a custody battle. This is something that you always need to keep in mind when you are using decision analysis. In some cases, you can estimate the value of non-monetary consequences, and in those cases, you can include those in the model. Maybe in some cases, you could estimate that if your client took a case to trial and lost, there would be some negative reputational consequences for the company, in addition to whatever the judgment of the court would be, that could be quantified in terms of loss of brand value, lost sales, etc. Perhaps you could estimate that the company will do $100,000 less in sales per year as a result of people viewing the company negatively. To the extent that reputational or other consequences of an outcome can be estimated and reduced to a dollar value, they can be included in the model just like the dollar amount of the judgment would be. You should always keep in mind when you're doing decision analysis the fact that it only addresses the flows of money in and money out, and it doesn't take into account any non-monetary consequences unless you can reduce them to money. Let's turn now to the 5 steps of performing decision analysis. Step 1 is to structure the decision problem. Step 2 is to supply the subjective information. Step 3 is to calculate the expected monetary value. Step 4 is to conduct a sensitivity analysis. And step 5 is to examine other considerations. We'll describe each of these 5 steps in the context of our first hypothetical, which is a litigation scenario where your client is a defendant in a patent infringement case, and you have the opportunity to settle that case for $500,000. The first question is, should you take it or not? The second question is, if you decide not to settle, should you file a motion for summary judgment? Both of these questions will turn in part on what is likely to happen if you take the case to trial, so we need to examine that outcome in order to choose the right answers to our 2 questions. This is the hypothetical we will use to walk through the 5 steps of decision analysis as a way of showing how to do the analysis. Step 1, structuring the decision, involves identifying all of the possible alternatives that are open to your client with respect to the problem that you're analyzing. In addition to analyzing those alternatives, you want to identify all the uncertainties that may occur along the way. In terms of identifying alternatives, as we will see in our first hypothetical, if you're talking about a potential litigation, you have an alternative of settling or litigating and then filing a motion for summary judgment or not filing a summary judgment motion. On the other hand, if you're talking about a transactional matter, you may have the alternatives of choosing to buy a piece of real property or choosing not to buy a piece of real property, or a third alternative, choosing to do a phase 1 environmental review before you make the decision whether to buy the property or not. These are the kinds of alternatives that you might face in litigation or transactional matters, and the important part of step 1 is identifying all the possible alternatives that are open to your client, and then all the uncertainties that can happen once those choices are made. Thinking again about the litigation situation, if you decide to go to trial, the uncertainty is whether you win or lose at trial, and if you decide to make your motion for summary judgment, you can either win that motion or lose it. If you lose it and find yourself going to trial, you can either win at trial or lose at trial. Similar to the case where you chose not to make a motion for summary judgment. These are some of the uncertainties that follow along the various paths that are open to you when you are thinking about a pending litigation. In the transactional example, one of the uncertainties is whether or not there's an environmental problem with the property. You may choose to buy the property, and then there will be either an environmental issue that will require you to do some remediation, or there won't be. We've also added that there's some probability that you can assess to the likelihood of having an environmental issue by conducting a phase 1 environmental review. Of course, doing a phase 1 environmental review costs some amount of money, and if you do it, it's not 100% guaranteed to find a problem, but it increases your chances versus not doing a phase 1 environmental review. Life is a series of trade-offs. Pay this amount of money and increase your chances of finding a problem, or save the money and take a larger risk. Decision analysis can help you identify, quantify, and evaluate these costs, risks, and benefits, and guide you to make the optimal choice. Let's turn specifically to our first hypothetical, where the first alternative you're facing is whether to accept the offer to settle for $500,000 or whether to litigate. As you can see on the screen, those two paths or alternatives are represented in the decision tree. Now, if you choose the settlement route, then the decision tree ends because you've settled the litigation and your outcome is that you have lost $500,000, which is equal to the amount of the settlement payment that you've made. Now, following the other branch of the tree, if you decide to litigate, then you have another alternative a bit further down the road, which is whether or not to make a motion for summary judgment. Once again, those two alternatives are represented by two separate branches of the tree. Along one branch, you're not making the motion, and along the other branch, you are making the motion. No matter which you choose, you'll face additional uncertainties along that path, which we also need to identify. If you make the summary judgment motion, you're either going to win that motion for summary judgment, in which case your decision tree ends because the litigation ends, or you're going to lose your summary judgment and you'll proceed to trial. At trial, you'll once again face uncertainty and several different possible outcomes. You either win at trial or you lose, and you can see that that's reflected in the decision tree as well. Now, if you win, that again stops the decision tree because you've received a defense verdict and you don't owe the plaintiff anything. We do include the attorney's fees you had to pay to be represented at trial, just like we did if you chose to file a summary judgment motion, because that is often a significant cost that needs to be included. If, on the other hand, you lose at trial, we've modeled out three potential outcomes in terms of how much money you would be required to pay the plaintiff in that scenario. We've styled them as low, medium, and high cases in terms of what damages you might be required to pay. As I mentioned before, you don't have to do separate low, medium, and high case scenarios. You could just collapse it down into an average of the amount you would have to pay if you lose. But if you did that, you'd need to be sure to weight the average by the probabilities of each of the low, medium, and high cases occurring that led you to come up with an overall average that you are estimating is the total amount you'd have to pay if you lost at trial. That said, it's usually better to show your work by including the different cases and the weights you are assigning to each to make it clear what amounts and probabilities you are assigning to each of them so you can test them. For example, is it really a 25% chance of a high case verdict, or is that too pessimistic? Would I really only lose $1,300,000 in the low case, or could it be higher? The more you can break down a problem into as much detail as you can, the better you can see and test the various assumptions you are making. At the end of the day, the result that your decision tree says is the optimal one is only as good as the assumptions you've made in terms of amounts and probabilities that you've used when you created it, so it's always best to scrutinize them closely. You also should be constantly re-examining your assumptions, particularly whenever you have more information, to make sure that they always represent your best estimates of the relevant amounts and probabilities so that your decision tree can be as accurate as possible. So this is an example of how you take a problem or series of problems. Should I settle this litigation or not? Should I file a motion for summary judgment or not? And you map it out into a decision tree where you've included all of your possible alternatives as well as all of your possible uncertainties that are not known but can be predicted. One note here on nomenclature, as we are creating decision trees that you should know because your clients who are finance types and MBAs will be very familiar with decision trees and the names that are given to its various parts. Anytime that you have a decision that you're making, that's referred to as a decision node, and those are reflected in the chart with a square. You'll see squares at the points in the decision tree where you make decisions to litigate or settle and to make a summary judgment motion or not to make one. Anytime you have an uncertainty, that's called a chance node, and that's represented by a circle in the decision tree. You'll see circles at the points where your summary judgment motion is either denied or granted, and where either you win at trial or the plaintiff wins, and also where the amount of the award is determined. That's what MBAs call decision and chance nodes. The next thing is to think of separate paths along the tree starting from left to right are possible scenarios, and each scenario is independent of every other possible scenario. So in one possible scenario, you settle, and in which case you move to the lowest branch of the tree and you stop. That's one potential scenario. Another potential scenario is that you don't settle. You make your motion for summary judgment and you win. So that's another potential scenario. And you stop at that branch of the tree. Another potential scenario is you make your motion and you lose and you continue down. So you can think of each of these possible paths moving from left to right as a potential scenario. And then finally, when you get to the end of the tree on the right-hand side, those are the endpoints, which are often referred to as outcomes. In the scenario where you decide to settle, that scenario has an endpoint and an outcome where you pay $500,000 to the plaintiff as a settlement amount. That's how the tree works, and also some of the nomenclature that MBAs would use when they are looking at decision trees. Earlier, I mentioned the concept of expected monetary value. Expected monetary value is a way of taking future outcomes, discounting those outcomes by the probability that they will occur, and then comparing those amounts to determine which is the highest. In other words, which one of the scenarios you have available to you maximizes your expected monetary value. To take a very simple example, let's say that you're choosing whether or not to buy a raffle ticket, and let's say the raffle ticket costs $1. If you win the raffle, you get $100. Finally, let's assume there were 1,000 raffle tickets issued. So you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of winning, which then essentially means that your probability of winning is 0.001. And the flip side is that your probability of losing is 0.999. In order to compute the expected monetary value, what you would do is you take your probability of winning, which is 0.001, and multiply that by what you gain if you win, which is the $100 that you win the prize, minus $1 that you spent on the ticket, so a net gain of $99. $99 times 0.001 is what happens if you win, so the value of that outcome is $0.099, or just under 10 cents. Now you need to calculate the value of your outcome if you lose. If you lose $1, which is the cost of the ticket, times the probability that you'll lose, which is 0.999. Doing the math there, it's negative $0.999, or just under $1 in the red. When you add the value of those two outcomes together, you get negative 90 cents, or put another way, you lose 90 cents. So your one alternative is to buy a raffle ticket. And if you do that, the expected monetary value of that outcome is negative 90 cents. Your other alternative is not to buy a raffle ticket at all, and the expected monetary value of that outcome is $0. If you wanted to break it down further, that alternative costs $0, and it has a 100% chance of costing $0, so the expected monetary value of not buying a raffle ticket is $0. Now, in choosing between those two alternatives, buying a raffle ticket and not buying a raffle ticket, not buying the raffle ticket where you don't lose any money, is superior to buying the ticket where your expected monetary value is negative. Now, this is why people shouldn't play lotteries or shouldn't play raffles, because your expected monetary value is always less than the cost of the ticket. Breaking down the raffle ticket problem is a simple way of explaining how expected monetary value works. You're going through each of the payoffs or outcomes that relate to that particular endpoint. For example, you buy the ticket and win. That's one endpoint. You buy the ticket and lose. That's another endpoint. And the final endpoint, where you don't buy the ticket at all, you're multiplying the outcomes associated with each endpoint by the probability that each will occur, and then you're summing them up. And that will yield an expected monetary value for each part of your decision tree. As you move back from right to left, and we'll talk about this in a moment, you are adding up those expected monetary values and comparing them along the way. I mentioned this before, but it bears repeating that decision trees and comparing expected monetary values will lead you to the optimal choices, but only in terms of which scenarios produce the highest expected monetary value. The analysis doesn't take into account any other factors that you might want to consider in terms of making the decision aside from expected monetary value. To the extent you can reduce other factors to dollar amounts and incorporate them, The analysis can be improved to take those factors into account, but there always will be factors that can't be reduced to dollar amounts. In the case of buying a raffle ticket, the decision is clear not to buy a ticket when you look at it in terms of expected monetary value. But if it's your 10-year-old daughter who is selling raffle tickets to support her Girl Scout troop, the only question is usually how many tickets you are going to buy, not whether or not to buy any. Because your criteria in that case isn't maximizing your expected monetary value, but rather supporting your daughter and her Girl Scout troop, you will make a different decision and it will be the right decision for you. Decision analysis is a tool that can help inform a decision you need to make, but the outcome of decision analysis is rarely the only basis upon which you can or should decide. The need to consider other factors isn't only something to think about outside of a business context. It is true that the reason expected monetary value is so important is that most businesses are for-profit entities, and their main goal is to maximize profits or minimize losses. So in most cases where you have the choice between, for example, filing a motion for summary judgment or not, you'll always choose the alternative that maximizes your client's expected monetary value. In some ways, litigation is a very straightforward example where everyone wants to maximize profits or minimize losses. Now, of course, if your client were a not-for-profit, let's say we're a charity may well make a decision based on something other than expected monetary value. One could imagine that the choice of what type of services to offer to the people served by the charity might decide that rather than maximizing the expected monetary value, it might want to maximize the number of people that the charity serves. If the goal is to just serve as many people as possible, the charity might rationally choose to provide a smaller amount of help to a larger number of people over providing a larger amount of help to a smaller number of people, even if the latter could do more good in terms of really affecting outcomes of the people that receive the larger amount of help. But for most businesses, expected monetary value is the baseline that you would use to suggest the optimal course of action, and then you would apply the other non-monetary considerations before you make the decision. To recap, in step 1, we outlined all of the possible alternatives involved in our hypothetical litigation scenario and all of the possible outcomes, which are the uncertain future events that could occur. For example, you could win at trial or you could lose at trial. You could win your summary judgment motion or you could lose your motion. We now move on to step 2, which is to supply the subjective information. In this step, you're going to do a number of things. The first thing you're going to do is for each of the uncertain events, and we refer to those things as chance nodes, you're going to have to assign a probability of that event occurring or not occurring. This is obviously something that's subjective, but as I mentioned, there are ways to test your estimates later so that you can have greater confidence both for yourself and your clients in the probabilities you ultimately decide to assign to each chance node. In some cases, the payoffs relating to a chance node are so skewed one way or the other that the optimal decision will be easy to identify and it won't much matter what probability you assign to that event. In other cases, it will be a closer call and the probability will matter, and in those situations, you can use sensitivity analysis to test your assigned probability to make it as precise as possible. For the purposes of the analysis, we now need to go through each of these chance nodes in the decision tree and assign a probability to them. The way you do this is to go through the decision tree starting on the left and moving to the right. The first decision node is whether to make a motion for summary judgment. One option is to make the motion for summary judgment, which leads you to the first chance node, which is if you make the motion, you have to make an estimate of your probability of prevailing on that motion of summary judgment. In this particular hypothetical, we've assigned a 50% probability, so 50% likely that you'll win and 50% likely that you'll lose. The next thing, moving from left to right along that same branch, is that in the event that your summary judgment motion is denied and you go to trial, you have to assign a likelihood of prevailing at trial. Here, we've estimated that you're 75% likely to win and 25% likely to lose. Now, you'll notice, of course, that all of the probabilities at each of your chance nodes have to add up to 100%. This is true even if there are more than two likely outcomes, as we'll see in a moment, that each of the percentages for each possible outcome has to add up to a total of 100%. In our summary judgment example, we've kept it simple by assuming that you're either going to win summary judgment in full or you're going to lose your motion in full. You could add complexity and precision to this by, for example, listing outcomes short of winning in full or losing in full. You could model out what it would be like if you win summary judgment on a certain number of the claims and not others, or really any of the possible results that the judge could order in response to your summary judgment motion. In that case, your chance node would be more detailed. It could have any number of possible outcomes, and you would then assign a probability to each of those occurring, making sure that the total of all of the percentages adds up to 100% when you're finished. The reason it has to add up to 100% is that something is going to happen in response to your summary judgment motion, and you can't build a correct decision tree if you don't identify all of the possible outcomes. Thinking about the next chance node, which is the outcome at trial, if you feel 75% likely that you're going to win, that of course means that there's a 25% chance that you'll lose. The total of the probabilities for any chance node must sum to 100%. Now, this is the rule, but you can exercise some judgment about how you apply the rule. Sticking with the trial outcome example, you could win, you could lose, but couldn't the case also end in a mistrial because the jury couldn't reach a verdict? Or alternatively, maybe too many jurors get sick and there are no longer enough jurors to fill up the panel? While you could include these potential outcomes in the trial chance node, you don't necessarily need to do that if, as is likely, a mistrial would simply mean that the case would be retried and you're back to another trial outcome chance node. Maybe if that happened, you'd learn from the experience you had trying the case and decide to adjust your probability of winning accordingly. Maybe after a mistrial because the jury couldn't reach a verdict on the plaintiff's claim, you might think your chances of prevailing as the defendant are now 80% instead of 75%, and that would be one way to handle the mistrial scenario. Keep in mind that once you create your decision tree, it doesn't remain static, but rather you should constantly adjust it in response to new information so that it represents your best estimate of the probabilities of the various possible outcomes at the time you are using the decision tree to identify the optimal choices when you are making each choice along the length of the tree. The final chance node moving from left to right is in the case of a plaintiff verdict. We've ascribed three possible outcomes: a low case, a medium case, and a high case in terms of the amount of money that your client would be required to pay the plaintiff. Once we identified those three possible outcomes, we assigned probabilities to each of them. Here, let's say we feel pretty strongly that the medium case is the most likely outcome, and we've given it a 50% probability, whereas the low case and the high case each are about 25% likely. Once again, everything's adding up to 100%. It bears mentioning that for simplicity, we've kept the same probabilities in terms of trial outcome and jury award for both the branch of the decision tree where we made a motion for summary judgment and the branch of the tree that we didn't make a summary judgment motion. That might be wise, but if you had a different setup where you broke down the summary judgment motion outcome into more than just win 100% or lose 100%, for example, you win on getting certain claims dismissed on summary judgment, maybe the tort claims are out, leaving only the contract claims still in the case, you might then want to adjust your likelihood of prevailing at trial based on what claims would still be in the case at the time of trial. You also probably would want to adjust your high, medium, and low case assessments, both in terms of the amounts you'd have to pay the plaintiff. If the tort claims are gone, maybe the damages couldn't include consequential or punitive damages, for example, and in terms of the probabilities that each is likely to occur. The point here is that when you are following a branch from left to right, you want to make sure you are assigning payouts and probabilities based on what you believe is possible given the choices you've made up to that point in the decision tree. While your estimate of the chance of prevailing at trial, if you choose not to move for summary judgment, might be the same 75% as you estimate if you chose to move for summary judgment and lost, it doesn't need to be. You just need to follow the tree along from left to right and consider the possible outcomes and assign probabilities at each part of the tree, assuming that you took the actions that led you to that spot in the tree. That's how you assign probabilities to the various events that are in your decision tree. Now, in addition to assigning probabilities, you have to assign dollar values to those outcomes. So let's go back to the beginning of the tree and work through the outcomes once again from left to right. Starting with the first decision node, which is represented by the square box, the first decision that you're going to make is whether to take the settlement offer or whether to proceed and litigate the case. If you do choose the settlement offer, you have to assign a dollar value to that outcome, and that one's easy because you have an offer to settle for $500,000. If you choose that path, it will result in a negative $500,000 monetary event for your client. That is, your client will be writing a $500,000 check to the plaintiff. Now, let's say that you don't do that and you move down the litigation branch. The next decision node is whether to make a motion for summary judgment or not. If you don't make a motion for summary judgment, then there's no cost associated with that motion you chose not to make. And so you just continue down the path. If you do make a motion for summary judgment, we're assuming that your client will incur $100,000 in legal fees that are going to be expended in making and arguing that motion for summary judgment. So along that branch, you have to have a negative $1,000 outcome reflecting the legal fees for your motion for summary judgment. Now, moving again from left to right, your summary judgment motion can either be denied or it can be granted. So the next thing that you have to do in terms of putting in your outcomes is if you go to trial and you win, then that outcome results, even though it's a win for you, there's still a negative cost to your client, which is the negative $1,000 that you spent for your summary judgment motion, plus an additional negative $200,000 that you spent in legal fees at trial for a total of negative $300,000. These values are represented in the decision tree to the right of the outcomes, where summary judgment is granted negative $100,000 there, and where summary judgment is denied, but you win at trial negative $300,000 there, which is the $100,000 plus the $200,000. Turning now to the other branch of the tree where you chose not to make a motion for summary judgment, the next chance node is whether you win or lose at trial. If you win at trial, your result is only a negative $200,000 because you only expended legal fees at trial, not in summary judgment. So all that is left now at both the top and bottom branches of the tree is what happens if you lose at trial. If you lose at trial, that's when we have the three different scenarios we've estimated. And this is where you would, in addition to estimating the probabilities of each of these outcomes, which we've already done, is to estimate the value of these outcomes themselves. Starting on the top branch of the decision tree, the case where you made but lost a motion for summary judgment, we look first at the low award case. In the low award case, we're estimating that you'd owe $1 million to the plaintiff as damages in this patent infringement case. We're also assuming that you'd be required to pay an additional $1,000 to the plaintiff in terms of an award of legal fees. If you add $1 million in damages to the plaintiff, $100,000 in legal fees to the plaintiff, plus the $300,000 of your own legal fees you've expended between summary judgment and trial, that totals negative $1,400,000 in total outcome for that scenario. So that brings us to the end of that part of the tree branch. You do the same thing for the medium and the high cases, except in those scenarios, we're imagining that the judgment owed to the plaintiff would be higher, $5 million in the medium case and $10 million in the high case. And in each case, you add the same $400,000 because of your legal fees and the plaintiff's legal fees, as we discussed in the low case. Those total amounts then become negative $5,400,000 in the medium case and negative $10,400,000 in the high case. That brings us to the end of this branch of the tree. The point to remember when you are calculating these outcomes is to make sure you include everything that is a cost associated with each outcome. So in our case, the need to include your own legal fees plus a legal fee award to the plaintiff, if it's applicable, in addition to the actual judgment. In the materials that accompany this program, we've provided the Excel model that you can use to build your own decision trees. And now we've shown you the process by which you map out the tree and supply the subjective information key things to check in terms of constructing your tree. For example, whenever you have a chance node, all of the possible outcomes, whether there are 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever, the probabilities of all of those potential outcomes have to sum to 100%. Something has to happen and it has to be one of your potential outcomes. Or if it isn't, you need to add at least one more outcome, and those outcomes must sum to 100%. You also can add or remove additional detail at any chance node. Here, where we were talking about a plaintiff verdict, you could have had an outcome for a plaintiff verdict and a specific number there and a specific probability. Or, as we showed, you can break that down into low, medium, and high cases and assign particular probabilities and values to each. You can break it down even further than that. For example, you could have 6 different levels of potential outcomes, or if you have certain claims that would necessarily carry with them a fixed dollar amount, you could break your tree down into higher levels of detail. Let's say you lose on a certain claim that perhaps had liquidated damages, then you could specify exactly what that award would be if that outcome obtained. The point to keep in mind is that you can add as much detail to your decision tree as you like and also tailor it to what level of detail your client prefers. Some clients prefer more detail, and if you have the ability to add detail, you can do that. Some clients prefer the opposite, in which case you can collapse your tree into what are the essential potential outcomes. In each case, it's up to you and should be informed by your purpose in preparing the tree in the first place and what level of specificity and detail will be helpful to you and your client. In any case, the model and the tools that we've given you, as well as having shown you the process of how to construct and manipulate the tree, should give you the ability to do that for any type of problem that involves substantial uncertainty that you want to model out in a decision tree. So that's step 2, supply the information. And we've now filled in the decision tree with all the information we need, and we're ready to move on to step 3, which is to calculate the expected monetary value. Once you have the tree built, you work backwards. We've been going from left to right, and it bears mention that going from left to right along a decision tree is also going in chronological order. You're making the first decision that you have to make in time, which is to settle or litigate. And then the next decision that you have to make in time, which is to file a summary judgment motion or not. And then everything else flows from that in chronological order from left to right. When you're doing step 3, calculating the expected monetary value, you actually start moving from right to left. You go back the opposite way along the chain, and you will calculate the expected monetary value of each of the individual branches of the tree. And if at any point you have a decision to make, and here, as you'll see, the first decision we have to make moving from right to left is whether to make the summary judgment motion, you'll choose the decision that maximizes your expected monetary value. Now, this is a very mechanical process, and the spreadsheet that we're providing along with this program will provide the formulas that will calculate all this for you. So once you've put in the outcomes and you've put in the probabilities, the spreadsheet is going to go ahead and calculate everything for you. I'm going to walk you through it so that you understand how the calculations work, even though the spreadsheet will do the work for you once you've completed steps 1 and 2. Let's start with the branch of the tree at the top where we made the motion for summary judgment. It was denied, and we're now at the end with an outcome after trial. We have 3 plaintiff verdict scenarios. You have the low, medium, and high case. You have a 25% chance of a low case, a 50% chance of a medium case, and a 25% chance of a high case. You would multiply the probability of each of those outcomes times the outcome itself. So in the case of the low case, a 25% probability times $1,400,000. And recall we got that because of a $1 million judgment plus $100,000 in plaintiff's legal fees plus $300,000 of your legal fees equals negative $350,000. Next is the medium case, which is a 50% probability times negative $5,400,000, which equals negative $2,700,000. And finally, the high case, which is a 25% probability times negative $10,400,000, which equals negative $2,600,000. The next step is to add up those 3 values, negative $350,000, negative $2,700,000, and negative $2,600,000, which equals negative $5,650,000. That is the expected monetary value of a plaintiff verdict, and it's shown above the plaintiff wins side of the trial chance node. Now, you don't know whether you're high, medium, or low case. All you know at this part of the decision tree is that you have a plaintiff verdict. So if it's a plaintiff verdict, based on the percentages that you've estimated and the dollar values associated with those outcomes, you've calculated negative $5,650,000 as the expected monetary value of a plaintiff's verdict. We've finished the plaintiff wins branch of this part of the decision tree. Now let's do the defendant wins part. If the defendant wins at trial, what is the expected monetary value of that outcome? Well, it's simple. You know that if you win at trial, you're not going to be required to pay a damages award to the plaintiff or the plaintiff's legal fees. Accordingly, the only liability you'll have is your legal fees, and this is your legal fees both for your motion for summary judgment, because we're talking about that branch of the tree, plus an additional $200,000 in legal fees that you expended at trial. So the expected monetary value of a defense verdict at trial is negative $300,000. So now you have your expected monetary value for a plaintiff verdict, and you have your expected monetary value for a defendant's verdict, and you can see those amounts listed above the plaintiff wins, defendant wins, branches of the trial outcome chance node. The next step is to go further back to the left and determine what the expected monetary value of having your summary judgment motion denied is. To do that, it's the same calculation as before, where you would take the expected monetary value of a plaintiff verdict, that's the negative $5,650,000 we talked about before, multiplied by the probability that you're going to have a plaintiff verdict, which we're estimating is 25%, which totals negative $1,412,500. Then you need to add to it the expected monetary value of a defense verdict. That's negative $300,000 in cost times the probability of a defense verdict, which is 75%, which is $225,000. Adding those two values gives you negative $1,637,500, and that's your expected monetary value of having your summary judgment motion denied. Now, what about having your summary judgment motion granted? You follow the same process, but it's simple because the result of that outcome is just the negative $1,000 you would spend in legal fees on the summary judgment motion only. You'll see those two values, negative $1,637,500 and negative $100,000 listed above the SJ denied and SJ granted branches of the summary judgment outcome chance node. The next step is to continue going back to your left to calculate the expected monetary value of your summary judgment motion in total. Following the same process, you take the negative $1,637,500 for the scenario where your summary judgment motion is denied, and you multiply that by the probability of that occurring, which you've estimated here to be 50%, which yields negative $818,750. You add to that the expected monetary value of your summary judgment being granted, which is the negative $1,000 times the probability of that event occurring, which is also 50%, which is negative $50,000. Adding those two together, negative $818,750 and negative $50,000, gives you negative $868,750. And that's the expected monetary value of making a summary judgment motion. So we've completed this branch of the tree because there are no more outcomes that we need to deal with moving further left on the decision tree. The only thing further to the left of the summary judgment outcome is the decision whether to make a motion for summary judgment, and further back to the left and further back in time, the decision whether to litigate or settle. We'll have the information to make those decisions once we calculate the expected monetary values for the bottom half of the decision tree where you decide not to make a summary judgment motion. Looking at that branch of the tree, and again, starting from the right-hand side, you go back from right to left. In the case of the plaintiff winning in that scenario, you have the high, medium, and low awards just like you did before. The only difference is that in this branch of the tree where you decided not to make a summary judgment motion, your legal fees are $100,000 less because you didn't make a motion for summary judgment. The only legal fees you have are the legal fees that you expended at trial plus in the outcome where the plaintiff prevails. We're assuming you're required to pay $100,000 of the plaintiff's legal fees in addition to the judgments. So you follow the same process that we walked through before in terms of weighting the awards by their respective probabilities. And when you sum all of those up, you get an expected monetary value of a plaintiff verdict of negative $5,550,000. Now, looking at the other branch of this part of the decision tree, what happens if you win? Your expected monetary value is negative $200,000, the same as it was in the top branch of the tree, except you saved $100,000 by not having moved for summary judgment. Next, we need to determine the expected monetary value of not making a summary judgment motion. To do that, we take the two possible outcomes, the plaintiff winning a trial and the defendant winning a trial, and multiply those by their respective weights. Again, we've assumed the same probability that the plaintiff will prevail of 25% and that the defendant will prevail at 75%. When you do that calculation for each outcome and add them together, you come up with negative $1,537,500. That is your expected monetary value of not making a summary judgment motion. At this point, we've made all of the necessary calculations of expected monetary value in the decision tree. We can tell that we are done with the calculations because if you look further to the left of the no SJ motion alternative, there are no more chance node circles in the tree, and there are only decision node squares in the tree. We're now ready to compare expected monetary values and identify the optimal choices at each point along the decision tree. Once again, we are moving from right to left, but starting with decision node squares instead of focusing on chance node circles. The first decision node from right to left is whether to make the summary judgment motion. Now, having done the calculations, you simply compare the expected monetary value of those two choices. If you make the summary judgment motion, the expected monetary value of that is negative $868,750. If you don't make a summary judgment motion, the expected monetary value is negative $1,537,500. Anytime you have a choice to make in a decision tree, you choose the alternative that maximizes your expected monetary value. Here, making the summary judgment motion is superior to not making the summary judgment motion because your expected monetary value is higher. More specifically, it's a lower negative number, a negative $868,750 versus negative $1,500,000. As a result, you choose to make the summary judgment motion and you cross out the branch of the tree that has the inferior outcome, which is to not make a summary judgment motion. As they say, you've pruned off the bottom of the tree now that you've determined that making a summary judgment motion maximizes your expected monetary value as compared to not making one. Now that you know that making a summary judgment motion is a better choice, you can go back further to the left to the next decision that you need to make, which is whether to settle or whether to litigate. This is also the last decision you need to make, but there could be more and you just follow the same approach for each one. Compare the expected monetary value of each choice. Choose the one that is higher in this case, less negative, cross out the inferior choice, and keep moving left to the decision that is the next prior one in time until you reach the beginning of your decision tree. Looking at the decision to litigate or settle, you're comparing your expected monetary value of those two alternatives, just like we did with the summary judgment motion. In the case of settlement, we know what that expected monetary value result is. It's just the negative $500,000 you would pay the plaintiff to settle. You compare that to the expected monetary value of litigating the case, which we now know is negative $868,750, to determine which choice maximizes your expected monetary value. Obviously, it's the choice to settle because negative $500,000 is better than negative $868,750. So here, the optimal choice is to settle the case for negative $500,000 rather than litigate it, so you could choose to settle and cross out the litigate branch because it is inferior. Now you can see how step 3, calculate the expected monetary value, works. We move from right to left for each of the scenarios in each of the branches of the tree and calculate your expected monetary value at each of the chance nodes. Whenever you come back to a decision node, a place where you have two alternatives or more than two alternatives, here we just have two. You compare the expected monetary value of each alternative, and you always choose the one that maximizes your expected monetary value. In this case, it's making a summary judgment motion and settling that we would choose. Now, of course, the way this plays out, because you're going to settle the case, you're never going to get to that choice of making your summary judgment motion. But let's say, and this is what we'll talk about in a minute in step 5, For some other reason, you decide not to settle, even though your expected monetary value of settling is higher than your expected monetary value of litigating. Maybe your client has a strict policy of not settling cases because the client thinks that having a strict policy that you never settle deters future claims. So let's say your client decided to litigate instead of settle, even though, as we see from the decision tree, settling for $500,000 is your best choice, just considering expected monetary value. The decision tree also tells you that in that event, it's better to make a summary judgment motion than not, because your expected monetary value of the summary judgment motion is higher than not making a motion. So that's how it works. And when you step through the process, you'll see that the expected monetary value does yield clear recommendations among the various alternatives that you've identified in your decision tree. That's what makes it such a powerful tool for organizing and evaluating the alternatives you face when considering a complicated problem like a pending litigation matter. So that's how you do step 3, which is calculating the expected monetary value, which is often abbreviated EMV. You move from right to left and calculate the EMV at each chance node along the branches of the decision tree. Anytime you have a decision to make, you choose the path that maximizes your EMV all the way back to the left. At the end of this process, which actually has the very technical name of backward induction, but it's also commonly referred to as rolling back the tree, you have your optimal decision. In the case of our hypothetical, the optimal decision in terms of whether to litigate or settle based on the probabilities and the outcomes we've estimated is to settle for $500,000 now rather than going to trial. This is only step 3 of the analysis, but you now have the optimal decision based on the information that you've supplied. Step 4 is to conduct a sensitivity analysis. So what you would do, and we'll show you how to do this in detail in the second hypothetical, is to scrutinize the probability assessments that you've made. So in our case, a 50% chance of having your motion for summary judgment granted, a 75% chance of prevailing at trial, and a 25%, a 25%, and a 50% chance of the various outcomes in the event you lose at trial. There's a way to test each of those probabilities to determine whether or not your estimates are actually going to affect the optimal decisions. In some cases, the probabilities will lead to close calls, but in other cases, the optimal decision will be the same even if the probabilities are vastly larger or smaller than what you've estimated. Once you see the results of conducting a sensitivity analysis, you can choose to refine your probability estimates with confidence that they reflect your best estimate, having understood how those estimates will or won't affect the ultimate decision. Now let's take a look at our second hypothetical, and the example we've chosen is a television producer who is deciding when to go to market with a new television series. We've chosen this example both because I work in the entertainment industry, but also to show how decision analysis can be used in a transactional scenario as opposed to a litigation scenario. To set this scenario up, you should know that typically when you have a television series that originates in the United States, you'll have the opportunity to sell that series into various foreign markets. The series will have its initial run here in the United States, and after that, you'll have the opportunity to sell it in Europe and also potentially in Asia and Latin America. In today's world where subscription video on demand streaming services are highly popular in most countries throughout the world, you might be selling the television series to a streaming service like Netflix or Amazon, as opposed to in the old days where you only had television networks like B-Sky B in the UK, RAI in Italy, ZDF in Germany as potential buyers. Despite these changes in the market, this hypothetical still works well because you still face a choice about whether to try to pre-sell the new television series based solely on the script and the casting announcements that have been made, or whether you wait until you actually have a pilot, which is the first episode of a television series, which includes, of course, a complete episode before going out to potential buyers to sell it at that point. The advantage of waiting is obviously if you have a good pilot, it's better to wait until you have something you can show the buyers. But if you're less sure that the pilot's actually going to be good, you may want to pre-sell the series globally, or at least to pre-sell it in some markets, so that you can lock in a certain fixed price for the television series before anything is actually shot or shown to the buyers. So that's the scenario we will be examining in hypothetical number 2. In addition to making the decision whether to sell now or wait for a pilot, We're also going to include the decision whether to hire an expensive star for the TV series in the hope of increasing its chances of succeeding. Now, of course, hiring an expensive star is going to be expensive, and you always have that choice whether to hire an expensive star or not do that. Once you've made those choices, we're going to assume that the television series here is either going to be a hit, or it's going to be just okay, or it's going to be terrible. Those are the outcomes we believe are likely for this television series once it has been produced. Of course, you could model for more than just those three alternatives, and the process for creating the decision tree would be the same, and we are choosing just three for simplicity. Let's take a look at how we would create the decision tree for this second hypothetical by following the 5 steps that we went through before. Starting with step 1, which is structuring the decision, you're going to map out all of the alternatives and all of the potential outcomes that can occur in the context of the problem that we're examining. The first thing going from left to right, as you can see, is we can either sell the TV series now sight unseen without a pilot based solely on the casting announcements and maybe a script, but without any footage, or we can wait for a pilot. That choice is reflected in the first square at the far left, which is the first decision node. The choice is to wait for the pilot or sell it now. If you sell it now, that's the end of the scenario. But if you wait for the pilot, then the next choice you're going to have, as I mentioned, is whether or not to hire an expensive star to appear in that pilot. I've set it up so you have 2 alternatives that you're choosing between: hire an expensive star or don't hire an expensive star. But of course, you could break this down further into choices between 3 or 4 or more levels of talent to hire if you wanted to get more detailed. And the method of setting up the decision node and the alternative branches of the tree that flow from it are the same. Now, in either case, based on the talent decision you make, you're then going to have a number of possible outcomes. And as I said before, we're going to assume that the pilot for the television series is either a hit, it's just okay, or it's terrible. Those are the 3 possible outcomes. And one of those 3 outcomes will happen whether you hire the expensive star or you don't hire the expensive star, but the probability of each will change based on whether you chose to hire the expensive star or not. People generally think hiring an expensive star will increase your chances of having a more successful program and reduce your chances of having a less successful one. But in terms of setting up the decision tree, it's still those 3 possible outcomes. And so you see in each branch of the tree, you have a chance node showing those 3 possible outcomes. Now that we've mapped out all of the decisions and all of the potential outcomes along the way, it's time to move on to step 2, which is to supply the subjective information. To do this, we go back to the decision tree and start again at the far left and moving from left to right. The first piece of information that we can complete here is what happens if we sell it now. We estimate that if we don't wait for the pilot and instead we go ahead and pre-sell the television series and lock that in now, there is a certain definite price for that. In the hypothetical, we're going to assume that we can get $1 million if that's the choice that we make. Put another way, by selling it now sight unseen, we estimate we can lock in $1 million of revenue for the studio if we do that. Selling the series now also ends that branch of the decision tree, so we finish supplying all of the information we need for that branch of the tree. Moving up to the branch of the tree where we do wait for the pilot, next we branch off at the point where we must decide whether or not to hire the expensive star. Moving first to the lower branch where we don't hire the expensive star, we're going to assume here that if the TV show is a hit, the studio is going to make $4 million. If it's just okay, the studio is going to make $1,250,000. And if it's terrible, the studio makes $250,000. If you look at the bottom of the tree under Don't Hire a Star, you'll see at the far right those outcomes: $4 million, $1,250,000, and negative $250,000 are all laid out. Now, if you notice along the higher branch of the tree where we chose to hire the expensive star, which is labeled hire expensive star, we have those same 3 potential outcomes. It's either a hit, it's just okay, or it's terrible. But we've assumed in this hypothetical that the cost of hiring an expensive star, at least in the base model, and we will talk in a second about varying this as part of the sensitivity analysis. But for now, let's assume that an expensive star costs $250,000. We're also assuming that it doesn't otherwise have an effect on the amount of revenue that the studio makes in each outcome. So if the television series is a hit, the studio would make $4 million in revenue whether it had hired the expensive star or not. You could change this by coming up with different payouts for each outcome in each branch of your tree, but we've decided not to do this for simplicity. We have decided to vary the probability of each of the three outcomes occurring based on whether or not you chose to hire the expensive star, based on the common assumption that hiring an expensive star makes it more likely that a television series will do well. But we didn't assume that a hit television series with an expensive star would earn more than $4 million. It's just that a hit is more likely. Let me make sure that's clear because it is something you could vary in your analysis if you thought the facts on the ground were different. In our model, if the pilot is a hit, the studio is going to make $4 million in revenue, and that's going to be the outcome in the case of a hit. If you've hired the expensive star to produce that pilot, your revenue to the studio is going to be that $4 million minus the $250,000 that you paid the expensive star. And so if you look at the higher branch of the tree, the outcome where the pilot is a hit, the revenue to the studio is $3,750,000 instead of the $4 million that is shown for a hit in the branch below, which just reflects the $250,000 you had to pay the star. Same is true for the pilot just being, okay, if you didn't hire the expensive star, it's $1,250,000. But if you hired the expensive star, your net revenue is $1 million. That is $250,000 less. And the same thing, if it's terrible, you're going to lose $500,000, not $250,000, because you had to pay the star $250,000. Now that we've filled in the payoffs for all of the potential outcomes in our decision tree, the pilot being a hit, just okay and terrible, and the first scenario of selling it now versus waiting to see what happens later, we're ready to move on to assigning the probabilities, which is the next part of step 2, supplying the subjective information. In this hypothetical, the probabilities we need to assign are all related to how the television series will perform once it airs. We need to come up with our best estimates for whether it is going to be a hit, just okay, or terrible. Let's start with the branch of the tree where we don't hire the expensive star. We're going to assume, based on our best judgment, that we have a 60% chance that the pilot's going to be just okay. Most of the time for television series, they're just okay, so we're assigning that to be the most likely outcome for our television series here. Next, we assign based on our experience that there's a 30% chance that it's going to be terrible and a 10% chance that it's going to be a hit. What you're doing here is using your best judgment or your client's best judgment as applicable, assigning the relative probabilities of success for this television series based on the script, the casting, etc. Of course, you'd also take into account the genre. Is it a comedy? Is it a drama? What kind of production values will the series have? Is it low budget? High budget? Will there be special effects, etc.? You would take everything into account that you and your client deem relevant to making an estimate about the probabilities of success of this television series. Boiling it all down, we've estimated a 10% chance that it's going to be a runaway hit, a 30% chance this thing's going to be terrible, and a 60% chance that it's just going to be okay. There are two things to notice here. First, the sum of the probabilities you assign to those three outcomes must add up to 100%. One of those three things must happen, so you can't have a case where the probabilities you assign add up to less than 100%. If you think there's another outcome that could happen, you should create a branch for that and assign it a probability, adjusting the other probabilities so that they still sum up to 100%. The second thing to notice is that on the higher branch of the tree, where we decided to hire an expensive star, we're assuming that hiring that expensive star, again, using our client's best judgment as experienced entertainment folks, that the expensive star is going to increase your chances of having a hit or a just okay program versus a program that's terrible. So if you look at the percentages that we've put in the higher branch of the tree, we're going to say now you have a 20% chance of the program being a hit versus 10% because you have an expensive star. You now have a 70% chance it's just going to be okay versus 60%, and now you have a 10% chance it's going to be terrible versus 30%. It bears repeating that we are adjusting on the probabilities of these outcomes based on whether or not you hire an expensive star. We didn't adjust the payoffs for each of those outcomes. We did this for simplicity and to show how the payoffs are the same except for the cost of hiring the star. But if your best judgment is that a hit with an expensive star would be worth $8 million to the studio instead of the $4 million we've estimated, you would simply adjust the payout, which would be a net $7,750,000 after accounting for the $250,000 cost of the star, in addition to adjusting the probability of a hit occurring. You also could have more than 3 alternatives. Maybe you have 10 different levels of success for your television series beyond it's a hit, just okay and terrible, and it's easy to model it that way. Your decision tree will be wider and a bit more complicated to set up, but the process you would use is exactly the same as we use with our relatively simple tree. At this point, we've supplied all the information we need for our decision tree. We have all the probabilities for each of our potential outcomes at the 2 chance nodes. We have all of the payoffs for each of the outcomes that flow from each of those chance nodes. We also have the 2 decision nodes identified. Now we're ready to move to step 3, which is calculating the EMV, or expected monetary value. As you will remember from hypothetical number 1, when you calculate the EMV in step 3, instead of moving from left to right, which is chronological along the decision tree, you start at the right side and you move back toward the left. And then at any point where you have a decision to make, you choose the decision that maximizes your EMV. You cross out the other possible choice until you've reached the left side, and then you should have your optimal strategy mapped out. Let's start with the top branch where we decided to hire the expensive star. To calculate the expected monetary value of hiring the expensive star, you need to take the 3 possible outcomes. It's a hit, it's just okay, and it's terrible, and the probabilities that those are likely to occur, multiply each of those times the payoff for each outcome, and then add them all together. Here, in the case that it's a hit, the outcome is $3,750,000 for the studio, which we multiply by the probability that it'll be a hit in this part of the tree, which is 20%, and that gets us $750,000. We do the same for the outcome that it's just okay, which $1 million times 70% probability, or $700,000. And for the outcome that it's terrible, which is negative $500,000 times 10% probability, or negative $50,000. Then you add up those amounts, $750,000 plus $700,000 plus negative $50,000. You get $1,400,000. That's the number you see in the tree above the higher expensive star decision node. That means that the EMV, or expected monetary value of hiring the expensive star, is $1,400,000. Now we move to the lower branch of the tree and perform the same calculations. In this case, only 2 things are different. First, the probabilities are lower in the case of a hit and in the case of it just being okay, and the probability is higher in the case of it being terrible. Because we assume that hiring an expensive star raises the likelihood that the television series will be successful, the probabilities in the base case of not hiring an expensive star would be lower for the successful outcomes and higher for the unsuccessful outcomes. Once again, whenever you have a chance node and whenever you have different potential outcomes, whatever number of outcomes you have, if you have 2 potential outcomes or 3 or 5 or whatever it is, in this case there are 3 potential outcomes, the probabilities have to add up to 100% because something has to happen. If something else could happen besides the outcomes you've modeled, you need to add more outcomes. For us here, we kept it simple that it's going to be a hit, it's going to be just okay, or it's going to be terrible. In this case, where we don't hire an expensive star, the probabilities are different, but they still sum to 100% as they must. When you perform the calculations for this branch of the tree, for a hit, it's $4 million times 10% probability, or $400,000. For just okay, it's $1,250,000 times 60% probability, or $750,000. And for terrible, it's negative $250,000 times 30% probability, or negative $75,000. Adding these 3 amounts, you come up with an expected monetary value of $1,075,000. That's the expected monetary value of not hiring a star. Now you're at the point in the tree where you have to make that decision between hiring a star and not hiring a star. You make that decision by comparing the EMV of each choice based on the assumptions that we've made so far. When you do that, hiring an expensive star has a higher expected monetary value. $1,400,000 is higher than $1,075,000. So you would choose to hire an expensive star, and you would cross off the branch of the tree labeled "Don't hire a star," and that's reflected here in the model. Next, you work your way back to the first decision that you have to make, which is whether to sell the show now or wait for a pilot. Now, you know that the expected monetary value of not waiting for a pilot is $1 million because you estimated that at the beginning based on your experience. Now all you have to do is compare $1,400,000, which is the EMV of the branch of the tree where you wait for the pilot, with that $1 million in guaranteed revenue if you sell it now. $1,400,000 is larger, so you would choose to wait for a pilot and not to sell it now. You would then cross off the sell it now branch of the tree as is shown in the model. So in terms of having calculated the EMV and identifying the best possible choices, your best possible choices as reflected in the model are first to wait for a pilot because the expected monetary value of waiting for the pilot exceeds the expected monetary value of selling it now. And then you're going to hire a star because the expected monetary value of hiring the star of $1,400,000 exceeds the EMV of not hiring a star of $1,400,000 for $1,075,000. That is the end of step 3. Now you move to step 4, conducting the sensitivity analysis. We've talked about what the concept is here. You're going to test the ultimate recommendation that the decision tree provides. In this case, the recommendations that you wait for the pilot and that you hire the expensive star by testing the assumptions that you've made in terms of the probabilities of the various outcomes and/or the actual dollar amounts associated with the various outcomes. Now, we're going to actually show you how you do it mechanically, and there's essentially 3 ways to do it, and we're going to illustrate all 3 of those for you. Before we talk about the 3 ways, let's pick a variable to test. In the context of hypothetical number 2, one of the assumptions that we have in this hypothetical is the salary for the star. So let's pick that one to test first. As you can see from the model, we've estimated that the star's salary would be $250,000. But what if we can't get a star for $250,000? What if it costs more than that? Will that change the recommendations either to wait for a pilot instead of selling now or to hire an expensive star? We can use sensitivity analysis on this variable to answer those questions. In terms of framing the question, what we're really looking to determine is what is the highest salary we can afford to pay the star before hiring her no longer maximizes the expected monetary value. This is a type of sensitivity analysis because we are testing the sensitivity of the assumption that the star would be paid $250,000. If we could pay the star $1 million and it still wouldn't affect the decisions, that tells you that the model is not very sensitive to the cost of the star. If, on the other hand, paying the star $300,000 instead of $250,000 flips the decision, that tells you that the model is very sensitive to this variable. In terms of doing the sensitivity analysis on a variable, there are 3 ways to do it. The first way to do it is to do it manually. Once you have the decision tree set up, you can actually go in to the field in Excel where the star salary is listed and just change it. As you increase the star salary, you'll see that the expected monetary value of hiring the expensive star will begin to drop from the $1,400,000 we currently show as you slowly and incrementally increase the star salary. If you keep doing that, you'll ultimately find that there will be a point at which hiring the expensive star is only slightly better in terms of EMV than not hiring the star, which, as you will remember, is $1,075,000. When you do this manually, you'll come to a number, and in this case, that number is $574,999. So you could pay the star up to $574,999 and still have hiring the star maximize the expected monetary value versus not hiring a star. So that's the first way, a manual way, of conducting a sensitivity analysis not only on the salary of the star, but you can do the same thing on any of the other variables that you have in the decision tree. If you aren't comfortable using Excel beyond the basics, the manual method of testing sensitivities is probably for you. By copying over the Excel template we've created and using it for your own decision trees, You should be able to build new trees, supply the needed information, calculate the EMVs, identify the optimal decisions, and conduct sensitivity analyses on the key variables with just a basic understanding of and level of facility with Excel. That's a great thing because, as we've shown in these hypotheticals, decision trees are very powerful tools that you should be using in your practice. If you're game to try something a bit more sophisticated, the second way to do sensitivity analysis is using a tool that Excel provides. Depending on your version of Excel and whether you're using it on a PC or a Mac, it's either called What If Analysis or Solver or Goal Seek or something like that. You can do a Google or AI search for Excel help that includes any of these terms, and it should be able to direct you where to find them in the various menus you see in your version of Excel. This tool that Excel has essentially allows you, when you have something like a decision tree that has a built-in formula, to set a particular field to a certain value that you specify by changing one value in another field in order to reach the specified value. In this particular case, and you can see this now on your screen, you can set the EMV of hiring the expensive star, which is currently $1,400,000, to just higher than the EMV of don't hire a star. So here, $1 higher, which is $1,075,001, and to tell Excel to get to that value by changing only the field that has the star's salary. If you do that and click OK, Excel will come up with the same answer, $574,999, that you arrived at by manually changing the star's salary and watching the EMV of hiring the star decrease until it reached the same value of $1,075,001. That's the second way to conduct a sensitivity analysis, which is to use this built-in tool that Excel has called Solver What If Analysis or Goal Seek. This may seem intimidating at first, but if you play around with it a bit, you'll likely get the hang of it. In business school, you had to use Excel to build models and solve problems, including in the context of timed exams. So we had to get pretty good at doing this stuff in a short period of time. If you have all the time in the world and you are willing to play around a bit with the program, I think you'll find it very useful. What is also nice is that you can test whatever result you get from Excel by using the manual approach we outlined first. When Excel gives you a result that can't be right, there's some error in how you set it up, and doing the sensitivity analysis manually can help you find the error. There's always going to be the need to apply a reality check to what your model is telling you to make sure you've set up the model correctly, and sensitivity analysis is no exception. The third way to do it, and this is what we've illustrated in the box on the right labeled sample sensitivity analysis, is actually to do a little algebra. Anytime you have a decision tree and you want to test the sensitivity of one of your entries, you can just treat it as if it were a simple algebra problem. You've already seen how the expected monetary values are calculated by creating simple equations that involved multiplying outcomes by probabilities and then adding up the value. So let's say we wanted to test once again the sensitivity of the salary for the expensive star. You would make the star salary x in our simple one-variable algebra equation, and then you would solve for x. And once you've solved for x, you can create an expression in Excel that will effectively get you the value of x that satisfies a particular condition that you specify. In this case, we're testing the condition that hiring the expensive star, instead of being worth $1,400,000, is worth the $1,075,001. So it's just marginally better than not hiring the star, so we can see how much we can pay the star before it flips the optimal decision. If you do the algebra, you can solve for x, and you'll come up again with the same answer, $574,999. In the Excel model that we've given you, we've provided the formula. And you can see in the first box on the right under the sensitivity analysis is that we've labeled the question, what is the highest salary you can afford to pay the star before hiring her no longer maximizes your expected monetary value? If you click on the field that contains the $574,999 answer, you'll see the Excel formula, which is just an algebra equation that produces that result. That is the third way to perform sensitivity analysis, and as you have seen, they are all equivalent in terms of coming up with the same answer. Perhaps the last two are a little easier because they allow you to set your parameters and click OK, and Excel comes up with the answer. You also could experiment with AI tools by uploading your Excel spreadsheet and asking AI to perform the sensitivity analyses. Of course, given the significant risk that AI tools could make mistakes, you'd want to reality test those results using the manual method I mentioned before. Certainly, you can do it manually and keep raising the salary until you come up with the amount that makes it just marginally better to hire the star. At the end of the day, you can use whichever method is most comfortable, and the manual method is also a great way to perform a reality check on what result you are getting when using either method 2 or 3 in case you've made a mistake along the way, which is common particularly when you are starting out or in cases where you have more complex decision trees with lots of decision nodes, chance nodes, probabilities, and outcomes. The manual method always works, and you can launch right into that method without any further work as soon as you've got your tree fully built out. The next thing we thought we would test in terms of showing how the sensitivity analysis is done is the value of the outcome of the pilot, if it's a hit or if it's just okay. And so the question we've posed, and it's the second one in the sample sensitivity analysis box, is what is the lowest sale price you need to achieve if you sell it now, if it turns out later that the pilot is just okay, before waiting for a pilot no longer maximizes your expected monetary value. This goes back to the first decision that you're making, which is whether to sell it now sight unseen or to wait for the pilot. We saw in the beginning with the values that we started with that it's a pretty clear decision to wait for the pilot in that you have a $400,000 difference. But let's say that you aren't very confident in your estimates that a hit pilot would generate $4 million, or that if it's just okay, it would generate $1,250,000. Maybe that's overly optimistic, and that if the television series were a hit, the revenue it generates would be significantly less than that. What would the outcomes in those two cases need to be in order to still want to wait for the pilot rather than sell it now? Once you've set up the question, you can answer it using any of the 3 ways we just reviewed. Looking at the algebraic solution, the answer is that if you have at least $428,570 in revenue from a pilot that's just okay, rather than the $1 million we've been assuming, as long as you clear $428,570, you're still going to be better off producing the pilot and waiting rather than selling it now. Now, if you're talking about the case where we go without a star, you would need $1,124,998 in order to still have the result of waiting for a pilot be better than selling it now. The reason that the answer for hiring the star is lower is because we have higher percentages that the pilot's going to be either just okay or a hit if you hire the star. You have a 70% chance of it being just okay and a 20% chance of it being a hit. So collectively, that's a 90% chance that it's going to be at least just okay versus not hiring a star, where those collective percentages are only 70%. Put another way, the difference in probabilities is the reason why the payoff for the just okay scenario doesn't have to be as high when you have the star as when you don't have the star. That's another example of how you can perform a sensitivity analysis so you can test any variable, any outcome, or any probability that you have in your decision tree to make sure you are comfortable with your estimates. Let's say you're starting to wonder about making $1 million off a just okay show. What the sensitivity analysis shows you is that as long as you're over $428,000, you're still better off hiring the star than you are not hiring the star, and you're still better off producing the pilot rather than selling up front. Sensitivity analysis is a very powerful tool, and you need to make sure you are incorporating that into your process when you are using decision analysis. You should want to do sensitivity analysis because it can help to relieve the anxiety that we, as lawyers, experience when we are asked to put a dollar value on an outcome or a probability on a result. You'd clearly rather say a result is pretty likely than assign a 65% probability to it. You'd clearly rather estimate that your client would win a substantial sum if it prevails at trial rather than say the client would collect $5 million. This hesitation is understandable given the role we play as lawyers, but your business clients won't like those answers because it doesn't allow them to fill out their decision trees and figure out the optimal course of action. You can meet your clients' expectations by supplying the estimates, while at the same time getting comfortable that your estimates are defensible by conducting sensitivity analysis. If the same optimal decision is indicated whether you assign a 90% probability of prevailing at trial or a 50% probability, you can feel much better about assigning a 75% probability to that outcome. On the other hand, in some cases, your estimates will be right at the margin in terms of flipping the optimal decision. Those are the hard cases, but at least you'll know that this estimate is the material one, and you can focus as hard as you can on making it as good as it possibly can be. Maybe you even break out the possibilities into more than two. So, for example, it's not win or lose on summary judgment, but maybe five different potential results in terms of claims still in or out. So you can estimate the outcome with more precision if that's possible. You just need to remember that all probabilities must sum to 100%. You also need to remember that your decision tree is a living thing. It can and should change constantly as you acquire more information. The probabilities you assign today will be revised constantly in response to new information, and consequently, they should get better over time as you gain more information. These are the sorts of things that you can use sensitivity analysis to test and ultimately come to better degrees of confidence in your estimates when you're being forced to put hard specific numbers against each of these outcomes in order to do the analysis. Let's walk through one more example of a sensitivity analysis, this time on a probability estimate. The question we are posing this time is, what is the highest probability that the pilot is terrible, where hiring the star still maximizes expected monetary value? So if you look at the chart and the existing decision tree, we have a 10% chance that the pilot will be terrible if you hire the expensive star. And the question is, how high can that percentage be where it still makes sense to hire the star, where you're still maximizing your expected monetary value by hiring the star? Now, you know that if it's only 10%, you're fine because that's the baseline that we have in the model. If we use the algebra method, which is the formula that's embedded in the sample sensitivity analyses box, it reveals that the probability that the pilot is terrible can be as high as 26%, and it still makes sense to hire the star. Hiring the star would still provide you with a higher expected monetary value than not hiring the star, as long as the probability that the pilot is terrible is less than 26%. This gives you confidence in your 10% estimate because you know that as long as it's less than a 26% chance, so even if it's higher than 10, you're still going to be okay with recommending that the star be hired because that still maximizes your expected monetary value. After doing this analysis, maybe you decide to raise your estimate of the terrible pilot with a star to 15% or 20% to give yourself more breathing room, knowing that assigning higher percentages will not change the optimal decision. That's how sensitivity analysis works, and we've shown you three different ways that you can do it in terms of the mechanics, all of which are easy to do using the Excel model we've provided. You can use this model to create your own decision trees and do your own sensitivity analyses using any of the three different sort of mechanics of doing it that work best for you. If you want to be the kind of lawyer who can speak the same language as your MBA clients, it's critical for you to get comfortable both with this process of decision analysis and supplying hard numbers like probabilities and outcomes to decisions like whether to settle a litigation or whether to buy an asset. Sensitivity analysis can get you comfortable with making those judgments and show you that even within a certain range, your estimate is not going to affect the ultimate outcome. This is important because in the business world, people are used to making estimates all the time, and they tend to be overly optimistic, right? When you're dealing with managers in a business, if you're making an estimate of how many units am I going to sell next quarter, or what is my profit margin going to be in my next fiscal year, they tend to be overly optimistic. For example, I'm going to ship 1 million units, or I'm going to increase our margins to 30% in the coming fiscal year. That's common in the business world, in part because business people are asked to set targets, and often they are asked to set targets that are ambitious as a way to drive the best performance out of their organization and business. In business, people tend to shoot too high and be overly optimistic because their compensation is often tied to their targets. And even when they fall short, they tend to get rewarded for having shot for the moon versus having actually delivered on less ambitious targets. Conversely, lawyers tend to be overly pessimistic. You'd rather lowball and tell a client, our chances of winning are only 50%, so they're not disappointed or surprised if you don't win. Part of client service is to underpromise and overdeliver. While that's a good strategy for being a good lawyer, it doesn't work when we need realistic estimates for decision analysis. We can't help that lawyers tend to be more pessimistic and conservative when you're forced to give an estimate, or that business folks tend to be overly optimistic and liberal. The beauty of decision analysis, and more specifically sensitivity analysis, is you can use that sensitivity analysis to then correct for both overly optimistic estimates or overly pessimistic ones, and come to an estimate that really becomes more of a range. Instead of saying that it's a 50% chance of prevailing on summary judgment, that's my best estimate, you can get a lot of comfort in knowing that if it's anywhere between 50% and 25%, so maybe I'm only 25% likely to prevail, it's not going to change the ultimate outcome because of the other numbers involved. For example, because of the legal fees associated with going to trial that you would avoid if you got rid of the case on summary judgment. It's really a way to correct for what are natural tendencies to either over or underestimate probabilities or payoffs associated with outcomes, in that it allows you to come up with a range where you know that even if it's as low as 25% in terms of probabilities or as high as $1 million in terms of the payoff, it doesn't change the ultimate advice. Let's move on now to the final step. Step 5, examining other considerations. Let's think about this particular hypothetical and what some of those other considerations might be. Now, of course, if you want to maximize expected monetary value solely, you would do what we've recommended, which is waiting for the pilot and hiring the star. But as we've noted before, decisions in business, even decisions about how to handle a litigation arising in business, are rarely made solely based on maximizing expected monetary value. It's always really important to know what maximizes your monetary value so that you can deviate from it if necessary based on other considerations. But I think it's just as important to recognize that if you do decide to deviate from the path that maximizes your EMV, there's a certain price that you're going to pay for that. The price may be worth it in light of the other considerations, but you should be aware of the trade-off and try to quantify it when you deviate from the optimal path in terms of maximizing EMV. I think that that's something I can show you with a couple of considerations that might arise in our hypothetical number 2. We know that expected monetary value is maximized by waiting for the pilot to be produced and not selling it. Now, in the real world, one thing that comes into play are relationships. Every film and television studio has long-standing relationships with international buyers that routinely buy programming from the studio. Often, these customers will want to make sure that they can secure your new content. So it may be that your long-standing customer in Germany really, really, really wants this television series, and they want you to commit to selling it to them now. And they want you to commit to selling it to them for the $1 million we've modeled. You know that based on the decision analysis we just did, and that based on the assumptions we've made, you're better off waiting than selling now. It certainly could end up being a terrible pilot and you'd lose money, but on balance, given the outcomes and the probabilities, you should end up with an expected monetary value of $1,400,000 if you wait versus the $1 million if you sell now. But it's not unusual for relationship reasons to sell a television series early to your best customers if the customers really want to lock up those rights. You certainly can make that decision. And what's important here is that now you can quantify the impact of that relationship, right? You now know that if you choose to sell to the German customer, you're giving up $400,000 worth of value. That's the difference between your decision to sell that nets you $1 million and the EMV optimizing decision to wait that would net you $1,400,000. Decision trees are a great way to put a dollar value on whatever other considerations you are using to trump the EMV result. In this case, a customer relationship, so that you are aware of it and can compare it to ensure you are making the right decision. Here, you might conclude that this relationship is important enough for me to forego $400,000, but maybe it isn't. Maybe it helps you to see that, yes, they've been a good customer in the past, but $400,000 is a lot of money, and there's no guarantee that they're going to continue to buy from us. So maybe it isn't a situation where you want the relationship to trump the pure economics of it. Or maybe the opposite is true. I can take a guaranteed $1 million now and also make a good customer happy, and it only cost me $400,000 in EMV to make that call. The decisions will be made however they are made, but at least. The decision tree allows you to quantify the costs of overriding EMV with other considerations. Let's take another example. As we just saw, the expected monetary value is maximized here by hiring the star. And if we can pay that star less than $575,000, which we just saw a couple of different ways, we're still maximizing EMV by hiring her. What if you were forced due to relationships to pay the star $1 million? I keep going back to relationships, but this is the entertainment industry where lots of decisions get made based on relationships with talent, relationships with buyers, etc. If you're forced to pay $1 million for the star, you can use the expected monetary value to quantify the impact of that decision. If you plug $1 million into the model, it not only switches from hiring the star to not hiring the star, but it switches from waiting for the pilot to selling now. So your expected monetary value of having a pilot with a star that cost you $1 million has dropped the expected monetary value of waiting for the pilot to $650,000 from the $1,400,000 versus $1 million that you could get by selling it now. So then you would choose to sell it now, and you've lost $350,000 of value for having a star that you have to pay $1 million. In addition to that, not only are you losing $350,000 in the decision whether to wait versus sell it now, you're also losing $425,000 versus not hiring the star. So you have a total loss of $775,000, and you've now quantified the value of that relationship. If we're going to pay this star $1 million, which is far above the monetary value maximizing number that caps out at $575,000, you're going to incur a total loss effectively of $775,000. That could be a reason not to do the deal for relationship reasons, or maybe it's a small price to pay to preserve your relationship with a key star. Whatever decision is made, you can use decision analysis, including the sensitivity analysis, to quantify the costs of that decision. The ability to change the various assumptions that are behind the model to quantify what you're giving up if you decide to deviate from the expected monetary value from the course of action that is dictated by maximizing your expected monetary value is a very powerful thing. Just as important as it is to examine these other considerations as a second-order test on whatever the expected monetary value leads you to choose, you also can use those same tools to quantify the cost of pursuing those other goals in lieu of taking the path that maximizes your expected monetary value. Let's examine another consideration that the studio might also want to take into account, which is its appetite for risk. I alluded to this earlier, and it's clear that different individuals and different companies have different appetites for risk. The theory behind using the expected monetary value to identify the optimal decision is that the entity is risk neutral, which means that it has neither a greater fear of risk or a greater desire for risk than anyone else. But in the real world, different entities and different individuals can have greater or lesser appetites for risk. Let's assume that the studio in this hypothetical is very risk averse because it's had a string of failures recently, and they simply can't risk having another failure. That may be a reason for the studio to choose to sell the series now sight unseen without waiting for a pilot, even though, as we've seen when you do the analysis, waiting for a pilot maximizes expected monetary value. Again, what the expected monetary value allows you to do is to quantify, in this case, the magnitude of the risk aversion of the studio, which is the $400,000 loss of EMV by selling now versus waiting. The studio is giving up $400,000 because it is risk averse and choosing an outcome that will guarantee that it doesn't have a failure, even though that's not the optimal solution. As I mentioned before, money is never the only criteria that clients use when making decisions, but it's an important place to start. Take an employment litigation where the plaintiff has made a $500,000 settlement offer. That's a real number, and that's something that you need a real number to compare against, and that's why decision analysis is the place to start, but it's not the place to end. You need to think about other things. Let's say your client is a company that does compliance training for businesses. That's their business. And they've been sued for allegedly creating a hostile work environment. So let's say they're making that same choice between whether to litigate or whether to settle. It's fairly obvious that in a case like that, you're going to look at the numbers. You're going to look at the negative $500,000 to settle versus, let's say, a negative $800,000 if you go to trial. But that's not the full story, because for a client like that, the possibility that they themselves could be found liable for creating a hostile work environment when their whole business is compliance training would have substantial negative reputational consequences. So for them, it may be that even if in my scenario, and let's flip the numbers around, let's say that it is negative $1 million to settle versus negative $800,000 to go to trial. They may well choose to settle, even though a $1 million loss is worse than an $800,000 loss, simply because the negative reputational consequence of losing a discrimination case is much, much worse for them than whatever dollars were going to change hands in that scenario. Another example would be that you're representing a company that is very short on cash to fund its operations. They're living quarter to quarter because their margins are low and they don't have a lot of free cash. You may be facing a decision in a litigation where you would choose to go to trial because the plaintiff is demanding $1 million. And according to your decision tree and your analysis, you're likely to only lose $500,000 if you litigate. But for a company like that, the difference between $500,000 and $1 million could mean the difference between staying in business and going out of business, right? The ability to pay a certain fixed amount now is maybe a better result for them versus having to pay a larger sum later that could potentially cause the company to go out of business. It's a choice that involves financial health, risk aversion, reputation, and other factors, all of which are second order conditions that you can apply once you've done the strict EMV analysis. And these are things that you absolutely have to consider and, to the extent possible, quantify when actually recommending a decision, because that's how your client is going to do it. Decision analysis, I would say, typically gets you 70 to 80% of the way there. And for the last 20%, you apply these sort of non-monetary considerations to make your final decision. Whenever it's possible to reduce non-monetary considerations to dollar values, you should do that and add it to the model. I mentioned earlier the possibility that a company is going to suffer negative reputational consequences from a certain course of action. You might be able to reduce that to a number. You might say consumers are going to view us negatively, and that's going to mean we're going to sell 100,000 fewer units a year. My profit margin on each unit is $2, so that is $200,000 in lost profit. So you could figure in $200,000 of negative economic consequence. You could subtract that from whatever the EMV otherwise would be and actually calculate it and include it. Some things are not going to be capable of being reduced to a number, but you can apply them in a qualitative way and perhaps even isolate their value in terms of lost EMV, like we saw with the example where we were choosing to sell now to preserve the relationship with the German customer that had a cost of $400,000 of lost EMV. The economics is just one important piece of the puzzle to which you add the monetary value of these other considerations, anything that can be reduced to a monetary amount, plus other qualitative factors, to ultimately make a recommendation for your client that's reasoned and provides a solid framework for the analysis that explains how you got to that recommendation. Apart from actually doing the calculation, is having a framework that you can show your client. And if your client is a finance type, it'll be very familiar to him or her using this kind of decision tree analysis with probabilities and outcomes to come up with the optimal solution. Then you can work together to refine your decision tree and arrive at the optimal decision, taking all relevant considerations into account. So what have we covered today? First, we talked about decision analysis. We explained what it is and some of the benefits of using it, as well as some of the limitations. We've also covered how to do decision analysis. We reduced it to 5 simple steps that you can use to take any kind of complex problem, whether it's a litigation example, transactional example, or even any kind of personal decision you're making in your life, and reduce that to a set of alternatives and to identify the uncertainties that will arise along each of those alternatives. When you work through the probabilities and outcomes, you can arrive at the course of action that maximizes your expected monetary value. And then you apply sensitivity analysis and other considerations to that to ultimately make the decision. We went through two hypotheticals and showed you the process that you follow. And we provided an Excel model that you can use to create your own decision trees to solve some of the problems that you're dealing with in a way that will allow you to calculate everything very easily, as well as performing the sensitivity analysis. We talked about the importance of sensitivity analysis and how you can use it to increase confidence in the probability assessments that you're making, as well as in the dollar values of outcomes that you're assigning, and also as a great way to test your optimal decision. When you come up with an optimal decision based on an initial set of assumptions and probabilities, you can vary those assumptions and those probabilities and outcomes to come up with a matrix that will show you whether those changes are going to affect the ultimate outcome or they're not, and at what levels. That will give you more confidence in your ultimate decision that you've made using decision analysis. And finally, we talked about the importance of other considerations, non-monetary considerations like reputation and morale that you certainly want to take into account, in addition to just the economics. I hope you enjoyed today's program. Thanks very much for watching.